moment the transmission arrived, everything changed. I was standing at the observation window of Station Hermes, watching cargo ships drift between docking rings, when the alert cut through every speaker on the station. Not an alarm, something worse. A tone I had never heard before, steady, low, patient, the kind of sound that does not rush because it knows you have no choice but to listen. My name is Kira Vasquez. At 37, I was the youngest senior diplomat Earth had ever sent beyond the solar system. I had spent 6 years negotiating resource-sharing agreements between the inner colonies and the asteroid belt, and I was good at my job because I knew how to read silence. I knew when someone was hiding fear behind formality. I knew when a smile was a threat wearing a polite face. Nothing in those 6 years had prepared me for the voice that came through the speakers. It spoke in Galactic Standard, the trade language that humanity had spent a decade learning after first contact. The translation was immediate, cold, and precise. The Galactic Assembly of Sovereign Civilizations hereby transmits the developmental mandate to the planetary body designated Earth, and all territories claimed under human jurisdiction. Compliance is expected within 72 standard hours. Refusal will be interpreted as a declaration of hostility. This message is final. That was it. No greeting, no explanation, a paragraph, and then silence. Around me, the station crew had gone completely still. A docking technician stood with his handheld scanner frozen at his side, staring at nothing. A cargo supervisor near the airlock door had pressed both hands flat against the wall, as if she needed something solid beneath her palms. I looked out the observation window and saw that even the cargo ships had stopped moving. The pilots had cut their thrusters. The whole station seemed to hold its breath. My communicator buzzed in my pocket before the last echo of the transmission faded. It was the Secretary General's office, then the European Space Authority, then the Interstellar Defense Command. All at once, 3 different tones, 3 different numbers, all demanding the same thing. I answered the Secretary General first. His name was Paul Osei, and he was one of the calmest men I had ever worked with. When I answered, his voice was not calm, it was controlled, which is different. Controlled means the calm is something he was holding on to deliberately, like a rope in strong wind. "Tell me you heard it," he said. "I heard it," I said. "I'm at Hermes. I heard the whole thing." "Good. I need you at the assembly station within 14 hours. You are being appointed as Earth's primary delegate effective immediately. The credentials are already uploading to your identification chip." I turned away from the window and started walking toward the docking bay. What does the mandate actually say? The full text? It says we surrender military command to an assembly-appointed authority. It says we accept a taxation rate of 40% on all extracted resources. It says we welcome a developmental supervisor who will oversee what they describe as our transition into responsible galactic citizenship. He paused. That is a governor, Kira. They are asking us to accept a colonial governor. I kept walking. My boots made a steady sound on the metal floor. Around me, crew members were gathering in small groups, talking in low voices, looking at their personal communicators. The news was spreading across the station in real time. I could see it on their faces, the shift from confusion to something harder and quieter. How are the nations responding? I asked. 12 governments have already signaled willingness to negotiate compliance. 8 more are demanding a full Security Council session before any response is given. The African Union and South American Compact are both waiting for my recommendation. And the Americans are... He stopped. The Americans are doing what Americans do. I almost smiled. Moving assets. General Okafor has already made 3 requests to the Defense Council that I have not approved. I need you in that assembly chamber before she makes a 4th request that nobody can call back. I ducked through a bulkhead doorway and broke into a run toward the docking bay. I'll be there, Paul. The assembly station was called the Convocation Ring. It hung in neutral space between humanity's outer colonies and the nearest assembly border, a vast circular structure the size of a small moon, built by a species that had been traveling between stars when humans were still drawing animals on cave walls. When my shuttle cleared the docking approach and I saw the full structure for the first time, I understood exactly why it had been designed to look the way it did. It was meant to make you feel small. The outer hull was layered in materials that absorbed light and reflected only a deep, shifting violet. It rotated slowly on an axis that was completely silent, even in the vacuum where everything is silent. Attached to it were hundreds of docking spines, each one longer than most human buildings, and at the end of each spine hung the vessel of a different assembly species. Vessels of shapes that human engineers had never imagined, curved and multi-planed and alive-looking, like creatures that had simply chosen to be ships. My shuttle was given a docking spine near the outer ring, not the inner section, where the senior delegates gathered. The outer ring, the section for newcomers, for species still under review, for civilizations the assembly had not yet decided to take seriously. I noted that. I filed it away. The interior of the convocation ring was not what I expected. I had studied the briefing files on the shuttle, read every description our contact team had prepared over the past 11 years of diplomatic exchange. None of it captured the actual experience of walking through a space designed by minds that thought differently from human minds. The corridors shifted dimensions as you walked, not in a disorienting way, in a way that was clearly intentional. A passage that appeared to hold perhaps 30 beings could expand to accommodate 200 when a session began. The lighting came from no visible source. The floor curved upward at the edges. Everything felt slightly curved, slightly turned, as though the building itself was watching you from an angle. My diplomatic escort was a junior assembly aide named Veth, from a species called the Mirathi. They were roughly humanoid, but their skin had a faint translucence, and their eyes were a flat silver that reflected everything around them like two small mirrors. Veth was polite in the way that a well-trained staff member is polite when they have been told to be polite, and nothing more. Every answer was precise. No answer was warm. The executor will receive you in the grand convocation chamber in 40 minutes, Veth said, walking 3 steps ahead of me at all times. You will stand at the designated position. You will not approach the dais without invitation. You will address the executor as Executor Vreth Solon, not by any shortened form. You will not speak after the executor signals the end of discourse. Understood, I said. Veth glanced back at me for a fraction of a second. I think the brevity of my response surprised them. The Grand Convocation Chamber was the largest enclosed space I had ever entered in my life. It was circular, and so vast that I could not clearly see the far wall. Hundreds of elevated platforms rose in concentric rings around a central floor, each platform occupied by delegates from a different species. I recognized perhaps 30 of them from briefing files. The rest were new to me, shapes and forms I had no names for, beings that sat or floated or perched or arranged themselves in ways that human languages do not have verbs to describe. The sound in the chamber was constant and layered, dozens of species communicating simultaneously through their translation systems, a soft and complex noise like standing inside a very large instrument while many hands play it at once. I walked to the designated position on the central floor. It was a circle, marked in the floor material, perhaps 2 meters across. I stood in the center of it. I looked up at the platform directly ahead, elevated above all others, where Executor Vreth Solon waited. The executor was from a species called the Threen. They were large. Seated, Vreth Solon was still taller than I was standing. Their form was angular, geometric in a way that looked almost architectural, as though someone had built a being out of plates and joints designed for permanence. Their coloring was a dark gray-green, and the garment they wore, if it was a garment, was layered with the insignia of assembly authority, in patterns I could not read, but understood were meant to be read. Vreth Solon looked at me for a long moment before speaking. Ambassador Vasquez, the executor said through translation, in a voice that carried across the chamber without appearing to try. Your species has received the developmental mandate. You have come to acknowledge receipt. I have come to hear the mandate explained, I said. The chamber stirred. A ripple of translated murmuring moved through the platforms above. I did not look up at them. The executor's expression did not change. The mandate is self-explanatory. Explanation is not a standard component of this process. I understand, I said. I would still like to hear it. Another pause. Vreth Solon folded 2 of their upper limbs across the front of their body, a gesture our contact team had identified as patience being displayed intentionally. Your species has demonstrated consistent patterns of organized conflict across your recorded history. You have engaged in widespread environmental degradation of your home planet. You have operated within the galactic community for only 14 of your years. and have already manufactured military vessels with offensive capability. These are the grounds upon which the Assembly determines that autonomous operation of your civilization presents risk to the stability of the broader galactic order. I let the words settle. I let the chamber hear them, and I let the silence that followed them stretch for exactly 3 seconds. "Thank you," I said. "I will relay the mandate and its grounds to my government. I am requesting 72 hours to do so." Vreth Solon looked at me with those flat, ancient eyes. I think they were looking for something specific in my face. Fear, most likely, or awe. The posture of a small species standing before something older and larger and better organized than itself. I gave them nothing. 72 hours, the executor said. Granted. I nodded once, turned, and walked back out of the chamber the same way I had entered. Steady steps, straight back, no rush. Behind me, the layered sound of the chamber resumed, quiet and vast, like the hum of a machine that has been running for centuries and expects to keep running for centuries more. In my pocket, my communicator was vibrating continuously. 72 hours. 3 days to carry an answer back from a civilization that had never once imagined we would have any answer but yes. I stepped into the corridor, and I began to plan. The first call I made when I reached my assigned quarters on the outer ring was not to Paul Osei. It was to General Ieze Okafor. She answered in 4 seconds. She was sitting at a command console somewhere I did not recognize, and behind her, I could see 3 other officers working at stations in the background. She looked at me through the screen with the same expression she always wore, level and focused and slightly impatient. Not with me specifically, but with time in general. "You heard the mandate," I said. "I heard it before you landed on the ring," she said. "I've read the full text. All 37 pages." I blinked. They sent 37 pages? The summary broadcast was 1 paragraph. The formal transmission that arrived simultaneously at the Defense Command was 37 pages of legal framing, precedent citations, and jurisdictional claims. It's extremely well constructed, Kira. Someone put serious work into this. How serious? She picked up a physical document from beside her console and held it toward the camera. They cite our own treaty obligations. The Galactic Commerce Accords we signed 9 years ago contain a clause in Appendix 7 that grants the Assembly authority to impose developmental oversight on any member species that meets 3 specific criteria. We met all 3 when we commissioned the Arden-class patrol ships last year. I sat down on the edge of the sleeping platform in my quarters. The room was angular and uncomfortable in the way that Assembly-designed spaces always were, built for bodies that were not human bodies. The air smelled faintly of something I could not name. "They planned this," I said. "They planned this before we signed the Accords," Okafor said. "The clause was already in Appendix 7 when our negotiating team reviewed the treaty. They didn't flag it because it looked like a standard safety provision. It reads like one. It was designed to read like one." I thought about the Grand Convocation Chamber, about Vreth Solon's patience, about the way the 72 hours had been granted without any discussion, as though the executor had known exactly how long to give us because the answer had already been calculated. "What assets have you moved?" I asked. Okafor's jaw shifted slightly. She was deciding how much to tell me. "Adayeze," I said quietly. "I need to know. I can't negotiate without knowing what's already in motion." 3 Arden-class ships," she said. "I repositioned them 48 hours ago, before the mandate broadcast. They're in a holding pattern at grid reference 779, which is approximately where an Assembly blockade fleet would need to station itself to enforce a quarantine of Earth's system. How did you know a blockade was coming?" "I didn't. I made an assumption based on Assembly operational history." She set the document down. "Every species that has received a mandate in the past 400 years has had a blockade fleet in position, before the compliance window expired. Not as a threat, as a demonstration. They show up. The species in question sees the fleet. The species complies. No shots. No confrontation. Just scale. And our 3 ships sitting at that coordinate changes the demonstration. It means they can't perform it without us already being there," she said, "which is a different kind of message." I looked at the ceiling of my assigned quarters. The material it was made from caught the ambient light and distributed it without shadows, which was technically impressive and deeply unsettling. "The Security Council is meeting in 6 hours," I said. Paul needs a recommendation. What do I tell him? Okafor looked at me steadily. You tell him that compliance is permanent. You tell him that the Threen Executors species has been managing the Assembly's expansion policy for 200 years, and in that time, not a single species that accepted a developmental mandate has ever had it lifted. Not one. The supervised species stays supervised. That is not an oversight. That is the policy. The information landed in my chest like something cold and heavy. Are you certain? I had my intelligence team verify it through 6 separate sources over the last 18 hours. The Assembly's own historical records confirm it. They just don't advertise it. I stood up and walked to the small viewport in my quarters. Outside, I could see the docking spines of the ring, the ships of 100 different species hanging silent in the dark. Some of them, I now realized, were not here as delegates. Some of them were here as subjects. Species that had knelt when asked. Species that were still kneeling. There's something else, Okafor said. I turned back to the screen. There's a junior assembly counselor who has been trying to reach your diplomatic channel since you arrived on the ring. My intelligence team flagged the request because the counselor is from the Varathan. Do you know who the Varathan are? I pulled the name from my memory. A species that accepted a developmental mandate approximately 60 years ago. 63 years ago, she said. Currently under full assembly supervision, their delegate is not supposed to make unsolicited contact with non-supervised species. The fact that this counselor is trying to reach you anyway tells you something. It tells me they want to say something that the assembly doesn't want said, I replied. Which makes it something you need to hear. I agreed to meet Counselor Athene within the hour. Okafor and I ended the call, and I stood for a moment in the angular quiet of my assembly-designed quarters, thinking about 63 years. Thinking about what a species looks like after 6 decades of being supervised. Thinking about what it costs to send an unsolicited message when the entity that monitors your every communication is the same entity that controls your government. The counselor was waiting in a small side corridor near the outer docking ring, a location that had no active surveillance coverage for exactly 11 minutes during a routine calibration cycle. They were small, the Varathan. A rounded body, deep brown coloring, 4 limbs that folded carefully against their torso when they were still. Their eyes were large and dark, and full of a tiredness that was not the tiredness of a being who had not slept. It was the tiredness of a being who had been afraid for a very long time. They spoke in Galactic Standard, softly. Ambassador Vasquez, thank you for coming. Counselor Athene, I said. I understand the risk you're taking. Risk is a word with degrees, Athene said. What I risk by speaking to you is small compared to what your species risks by not listening. They reached inside a fold of their garment and withdrew a data chip no larger than my thumbnail. This contains assembly records that are not classified. Technically, they are simply not searchable. They are buried inside administrative filing systems that no one would find unless they knew exactly where to look. What do they contain? The long-term status reports for every species currently under developmental mandate supervision. They held the chip out. There are 41 species in that file. Each one shows the same pattern. Cultural centralization, military decommissioning, gradual resource transfer, reduced birth rates, population decline. The pattern is identical across every single species, regardless of their biology or their culture. They paused. In 63 years, the Varathan have lost 40% of our population. The Assembly's official reports attribute this to natural demographic transition. I took the chip. Ambassador, Athene said, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Does your species know how to say no? Not in frustration, not in anger, as a considered, deliberate, final answer? I looked at the chip in my hand. I thought about Okafor's 3 ships at grid reference 779. I thought about Paul Osei holding a rope in strong wind. I thought about the docking technician on Station Hermes, standing with his scanner frozen at his side. Yes, I said, we do. Athene nodded. Their large dark eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary. Then I hope, they said quietly, that you use it. I returned to my quarters and spent the next 4 hours in back-to-back calls with Paul, with the Security Council representatives, with the African Union's Prime Secretary, and with the leads of humanity's 7 largest colony governments. The debate was enormous and fractured and exhausting. Several voices were terrified. Several were furious. Several were both at once, which made them the hardest to talk to. I told them what Ithene had told me. I shared the data from the chip. I walked them through Okafor's analysis of the Appendix 7 clause, of the blockade pattern, of the 41 supervised species, and the identical curve of decline that ran through every one of their long-term reports like a thread of iron. And then I asked them a question. If we agree to the mandate now, I said, our children will be born into a supervised world. Their children will inherit a supervised world. How many generations do you want me to plan for? The call was quiet for a long time after that. In the end, it was not a unanimous decision. It was never going to be unanimous. There were voices that remained unconvinced, governments that held out, people who believed that negotiated compliance was better than confrontation with a civilization that was thousands of years older and vastly more numerous. Those voices were real, and they were not wrong to be afraid. I never blamed them. But when Paul Osei looked at me through the screen and said, "What is your recommendation, Kira?" I answered without hesitation. "We go back in," I said, "and we tell them what we are." I slept for 3 hours before the session reconvened. I dreamed about nothing. When I woke, I dressed carefully in the formal diplomatic uniform of Earth's interstellar delegation, deep navy, with silver at the cuffs and collar, the small circular pin of the planetary seal on my left lapel. I looked at myself in the reflective surface that served as a mirror in my assembly-designed quarters. A woman who had spent 6 years learning how to sit across a table from people who did not want to give her what she needed. A woman who had been taught that diplomacy is the art of making the other side feel like they're getting something even when they're not. Today was not that kind of diplomacy. Today was something older and simpler and considerably more difficult. I picked up my communicator and sent a 2-word message to General Okafor. Hold position. Then I walked back to the Grand Convocation Chamber to deliver humanity's answer. The chamber was fuller than it had been 72 hours earlier. Word had spread through the assembly. Every species that had a delegate on the ring had sent them to observe. Platforms that had been half occupied were now crowded. The sound of the chamber had thickened, a denser layering of translation signals and interspecies communication that I could feel in my chest like a second heartbeat. I walked to the designated circle in the center of the floor. I looked up at Vreth Solan. The executor looked back at me with those flat, ancient eyes. "The 72 hours have elapsed," the executor said. "The Assembly awaits Earth's acknowledgement of the developmental mandate." I took one breath. "Earth does not acknowledge the mandate," I said. "Earth rejects it." The chamber went silent. Not quieter. Silent. Every translation system, every background communication, every ambient sound simply stopped, as though the room itself needed a moment to process what it had just heard. Vreth Solan did not move. "This response is without precedent." "I am aware," I said. "The mandate is issued under lawful assembly authority, as confirmed by the Galactic Commerce Accords to which your species is a signatory. Rejection constitutes a violation of those accords and will be treated accordingly." "With respect, Executor," I said, and I kept my voice even, "I would like to reference Article 1 of the Assembly's founding charter, which predates the Galactic Commerce Accords by approximately 400 years. I pulled a data slate from inside my jacket and read from it, not from memory, but from the actual text, which I had read 17 times on the shuttle, and twice more that morning. Article 1 states, and I quote, that any species demonstrating verified faster-than-light capability and maintaining sovereign territorial governance is recognized as a full autonomous member of the galactic community, with all rights of self-determination therein. Earth achieved verified faster-than-light capability 14 years ago. We maintain sovereign territorial governance. Under Article 1, the developmental mandate cannot be legally applied to us. The Appendix 7 clause of the Commerce Accords cannot override a founding charter article. Legal precedent in the Assembly's own judicial records confirms that founding charter protections are superior to all subsequently negotiated treaty provisions. I lowered the slate. "We have read your documents," I said. "All of them." The silence in the chamber had changed. It had been the silence of shock. Now it was becoming the silence of attention. Hundreds of species, listening, watching a small delegation from a 14-year-old spacefaring civilization stand in the center of the floor and argue law with an executor of the threne. Vreth Solon was still. You are a young species. You are inexperienced in the complexities of galactic governance. The Assembly's concern is for the stability of the broader community. I understand that is how the mandate is framed, I said. But I want to be transparent with this chamber about what I found in the Assembly's own historical records. 41 species are currently under developmental mandate supervision. Not one has had that supervision lifted. The average population decline across those 41 species over the duration of their supervision period is 36%. The Assembly's official reports attribute this to natural demographic transition. I would like to formally enter those records into today's session transcript and request that the chamber review them. I pressed a button on my data slate. The figures appeared on the display screens that lined every platform in the chamber. The sound came back then. Not the quiet layering of routine communication. Something sharper, faster. Vreth Solon raised one limb. Ambassador Vasquez, you are here to deliver compliance or non-compliance. You are not here to conduct an audit of Assembly records. I am here to represent my species, I said. And part of that representation is making sure that every member of this chamber understands exactly what they are voting to do to us. The executor looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I became aware of my own breathing, slow and deliberate, the only thing I was fully in control of in that room. There is an Assembly enforcement fleet currently en route to your system, Vreth Solon said. It will arrive within 40 hours. Its purpose is to demonstrate the Assembly's resolve. Your species would be advised to consider that fact carefully before finalizing this response. I had been waiting for this. I kept my voice completely calm. The fleet will find, I said, that 3 human vessels are already holding position at the coordinates where a standard Assembly blockade pattern would require their primary formation to station. I am told our crews have made themselves comfortable. The chamber erupted. The sound was enormous, a wall of translated communication from 100 different species, going simultaneously active. I stood in the circle, and I let it happen around me. I did not move. I did not look up at the platforms. I kept my eyes on Vreth Solon. The executor stared at me. I could not read Threen expressions with any precision, but I had learned, in 4 days on this station, that stillness in a Threen was not the same as calm. It was calculation. How did you know the coordinates? Vreth Solon asked, and for the first time, the translation came out slightly slower, as though the executor was choosing words more carefully than before. We are young, I said. We are not unintelligent. Someone on one of the upper platforms made a sound. I did not know what species. I did not know if it was laughter or something else entirely, but it was picked up by a few others, and then a few more, and it rippled around the chamber in a way that I felt, rather than heard. Vreth Solon raised both upper limbs, and the chamber quieted. Ambassador Vasquez, the executor said, you understand that this posture of defiance carries consequences. Yes, I said. You understand that your species, 14 years into galactic citizenship, is choosing to position itself against an assembly that has governed this region of space for 8,000 years. Yes, I said again. We understand. And you make this choice deliberately. I straightened. I looked directly at the executor and at the hundreds of platforms above and around me, at the shapes and forms of 100 civilizations that had all made their own choice at some point in their history, when something large and certain came and asked them to kneel. We did not survive 10,000 years of ourselves, I said, to kneel before you. No one translated that. The chamber did not need a translation system for what it meant. Something that is true in that particular way does not need words. It travels directly from one mind to another, regardless of the biology of the mind receiving it. I stood in the circle and I waited. The executor said nothing for 11 seconds. I counted. The session is recessed, Vreth Solon said finally. 48 hours. I turned and walked back out of the chamber. I did not hurry. I did not slow down. I walked at exactly the pace I had walked in, as though the ground beneath my feet was the same ground it had always been, and I had simply never expected it to be otherwise. In the corridor outside, Veth was waiting to escort me. The junior aide's mirror-like eyes tracked me as I approached. Ambassador, Veth said, and then stopped, apparently unable to locate the next part of the sentence. I know, I said. 48 hours. My communicator was already buzzing. I already knew who it would be. I already knew what the next 48 hours were going to look like. But first, I needed to call General Okafor and tell her that the fleet was coming, and that our 3 ships needed to hold exactly where they were, with exactly the steadiness that the people sitting in them were capable of, people who had learned, over a very long history, to hold their ground even when the ground was shaking. I answered the communicator and started walking, and behind me, the enormous machine of the Galactic Assembly began, slowly and reluctantly, and for possibly the first time in centuries, to recalculate. I had been awake for 31 hours straight when the alert came through. I was sitting at the small desk in my quarters on the outer ring, going through the legal filings our team had prepared overnight, reading precedent cases from Assembly judicial archives that went back 200 years, looking for every instance where a founding charter protection had been tested and how the outcome had been argued. My eyes were dry and my back hurt, and I had finished my 3rd drink of something the Assembly Station's nutrition dispensary called warm restorative beverage, which tasted like someone had described tea to a machine that had never tasted tea but was trying its best. The alert was not on my communicator. It came through the secure channel on the small terminal mounted on the wall of my quarters, the one that connected directly to General Okafor's command network. It pulsed 3 times, and then a message appeared in plain text. Assembly Enforcement Fleet has entered sensor range. Current position, 4 hours from grid 779, requesting confirmation of engagement parameters. I read it twice. Then I opened the channel and connected directly. Okafor's face appeared on the screen. She was wearing a headset and had clearly not slept either. Behind her, the command center was running at full capacity. Officers moving between stations, light from multiple screens casting everything in overlapping colors. "Give me the fleet composition," I said.
11 ships,
She said.
7 of them are Threne pattern heavy cruisers.
The other 4 are from allied assembly member species, mixed configurations. Based on mass and drive signature, this is a demonstration fleet, not a strike force. Their weapons are hot, but their approach vector is designed to be observed from a distance. They want us to see them coming. That's the point. Our 3 ships are still at 779. Holding position. Captain Alton Webb on the carrier Meridian, Commander Priya Nair on the escort Falkland, and Lieutenant Commander Owen Darcy on the scout vessel Hanwell. All 3 crews have been briefed. All 3 have acknowledged current standing orders. I thought about those 3 crews, ordinary people sitting in metal ships in the middle of empty space, watching 11 much larger vessels approach them on their sensor screens, knowing that they were there because their government had decided that being there mattered more than the alternative. "Adaize," I said. "What are the actual engagement parameters? What has the Defense Council authorized?" Okafor's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted slightly. "Current authorization is hold position. Maintain communications silence with the Assembly Fleet, and do not initiate engagement under any circumstances. If the Assembly Fleet opens fire, our ships are authorized to withdraw to a secondary position, 700,000 kilometers behind the primary coordinate. Not to return fire. Not to return fire." I absorbed that. "And Vreth Solon knows we won't fire first." "Almost certainly," she said. "So the demonstration has a counter-demonstration," I said. "They bring 11 ships. We already have 3 ships there. They show up to make us feel small. We show them we were already comfortable in that space. But everyone knows that if they decide to push further, our people withdraw." That's accurate. I stared at the wall of my quarters for a moment. What happens if they don't stop at demonstration? What happens if they fire on the station? On Meridian 7. There's a colony on that rock. Population of 4,200, Okafor said immediately. I began civilian evacuation of Meridian 7 colony 40 hours ago, as soon as the mandate was broadcast. It was completed 14 hours ago. The colony station is currently unmanned. I felt the tension in my chest shift slightly. Not go away. Shift. "You evacuated before the Security Council authorized anything." "I evacuated because I have read enough Assembly operational history to know that a demonstration fleet does not come empty-handed." Her voice was completely level. "If they decide to make an example, Meridian 7 is the most isolated human installation in that sector. It was the logical target. The people who lived there are now on cargo transports heading toward the inner colonies. The station is metal and equipment. That is replaceable. I thought about 4,200 people who had packed what they could carry and climbed onto transports because a general they trusted had told them to leave their homes, without full explanations, without certainty, only the steady assurance that it was necessary. Did any of them resist the evacuation? I asked. Okafor almost smiled. It was a small thing, not quite visible, more an easing at the corners of her eyes. 3 families initially refused. We explained the situation as clearly as we could, without compromising operational security. All 3 families boarded transports within 6 hours. People trust you, I said. People trust that I am trying to keep them alive, she said. That's enough. I looked back at the terminal. Notify me the moment the assembly fleet reaches grid 779. I need to be in communication with the assembly chamber when it happens. Understood. Get some rest, Kira. You have maybe 3 hours before this becomes something no amount of diplomatic language can simplify. I knew she was right. I closed the channel and tried to lie down. I did not sleep. I spent the 3 hours reading the data from Athene's chip, going through the long-term status reports for each of the 41 supervised species one more time, letting the numbers and timelines and population curves fix themselves firmly in my mind, because I knew I would need them. I needed to be able to recite them without looking at the data slate. I needed them to be part of me. The alert came in 2 hours and 40 minutes, not 3. Assembly fleet has reached grid 779. Okafor's voice said through the terminal speaker. Our 3 ships are holding. The assembly fleet has decelerated and is taking up formation. No communications from them yet. No weapons discharge. They are sitting there. Are our people maintaining communications silence? Yes. Captain Webb has confirmed. They are sitting there looking at 11 ships, and they are sitting still, and not one of them has sent a single transmission. I was already dressed. I was already walking. Good, I said. Keep me connected. The Grand Convocation Chamber was in session by the time I arrived. It had been called by Vreth Solan, not by the 48-hour recess expiration, which told me the executor had received the fleet position report and decided the timing was useful. The chamber was even more crowded than the day before. I recognized the Verathan delegates section as I walked to the central floor circle, and I caught a brief glimpse of Counselor Athene in the upper rows, their large dark eyes watching me descend. I stood in the circle. Vreth Solan looked down at me. Ambassador Vasquez, the executor said, the Assembly Enforcement Fleet has reached the designated coordinate. Your vessels are present at that coordinate. The Assembly would like to know if your species has reconsidered its position. No, I said. Earth's position is unchanged. The fleet's presence represents the Assembly's intention to enforce the mandate should non-compliance continue. I understand, I said. I would like to make a statement to the full chamber at this time. Vreth Solan paused. The request was slightly irregular. The executor had not technically invited a statement, but denying it in front of this crowd, with every species on the ring watching, would have its own implications. You may speak, the executor said. I turned slightly, addressing not just the executor, but the full ring of platforms above me. In the past 14 years, I said, Earth has developed faster than light travel, from initial theory to functioning fleet. We have established 11 permanent colonies beyond our home system. We have made diplomatic contact with 43 species. We have signed 31 interstellar trade agreements and contributed positively to the economic output of this region of space. I paused. We accomplished all of this while managing a civilization of 9 billion people, with all the disagreements and complications and contradictions that entails. Because that is what we do. We do not manage well because we are simple. We manage because we are determined. The chamber was listening. All of it. The Assembly has looked at our history and seen our conflicts and concluded that we require supervision, I continued. I want to offer a different reading of that same history. Every time our species has nearly destroyed itself, we have instead rebuilt. Every time we have faced something that seemed impossible to survive, we have survived it. Not because we were lucky, because we refused to accept that the alternative was the only option. I took a breath. We are not asking the Assembly to trust us. We are not asking for special consideration. We are asking for what the founding charter of this Assembly guarantees us, the right to govern ourselves. We are exercising that right, and we will continue to exercise it. Vreth Solan shifted. Ambassador, the fleet. The fleet can see our ships, I said. Our ships are not moving. We are not moving. We are not threatening anyone. We are simply present, which is our legal right as a recognized autonomous member species. I looked directly at the executor. If the assembly fleet fires on an empty station, it will do so while our ships watch, and while every delegate in this chamber watches the sensor feed. The assembly will have fired on an empty structure that belongs to an autonomous member species that violated no charter article and committed no treaty breach. Every species in this room will know that. Every species watching from their home systems through this session's public broadcast will know that. Silence. Vreth Solan's upper limbs shifted slowly across each other. The executor looked at me, and I looked back, and the chamber held its breath again. The terminal in my jacket pocket vibrated with a text message from Okafor. One word. Standoff. The assembly fleet was not moving. Neither were our ships. The two groups of vessels were sitting across from each other in the dark of space, close enough to be on each other's sensors, far enough apart that no one had made an irreversible decision yet. From somewhere in the upper platforms of the chamber, a voice spoke in a language I did not recognize. The translation came through my earpiece immediately. The Preth delegation requests the floor. I did not know the Preth. I turned to look. The delegate was small by assembly standards, a pale-colored being with elongated fingers that wrapped around the platform railing in front of them. Their voice through the translation was measured and slightly deliberate. The Preth have been members of the assembly for 300 years, the delegate said. We accepted a developmental mandate 280 years ago. We have spent 280 years under supervision. A pause. We would like to formally support Earth's request that the Assembly review the long-term impact reports for all supervised species. The chamber noise surged. Another voice followed. The Mirathi. Then a species I could not identify from their platform position. Then another. Not all of them. Not even a majority. But enough that the sound was real and visible and could not be dismissed. Vreth Solan called for order. I stood in my circle and said nothing. I let the chamber speak for itself. Because that was what I had actually come here to do. Not to win an argument. Not to intimidate an enforcement fleet. I had come here to say something true, loudly enough, in front of enough witnesses, that it could not be unsaid. The session lasted another 2 hours. Vreth Solan adjourned it without a ruling. The executor was careful not to rule against the mandate, while also not ordering the enforcement fleet to act. It was a delay. Everyone in the room understood it was a delay. But a delay was not the same as a no, and I needed to make sure humanity understood that the next 48 hours were still extremely dangerous. I called Paul Osei as I walked back through the corridors. The chamber is fractured, I said. There are species openly requesting reviews. The executor is not committing to any action. That means the enforcement fleet is still in position, and still an active risk. What do you need? He said. I need the Defense Council to authorize defensive engagement parameters for our 3 ships, effective immediately. If the assembly fleet fires on the Meridian 7 station, our crews should not be required to simply watch and withdraw. They need to be able to respond. A long pause. Kira, that's a significant escalation in authorization. Paul, I said quietly. Those 3 crews held their position while 11 ships approached them. They sat still and said nothing, and trusted us. We cannot ask people to put their lives on the line for a principle, and then not give them the authorization to defend themselves. Another pause. Longer. I'll bring it to the council within the hour, he said. Thank you. I reached my quarters and stood at the viewport again. The docking spines of the ring hung in the dark, the ships of 100 species. The stars beyond them, impossibly numerous, impossibly old. Somewhere among them, 3 human ships were holding a grid coordinate because their species had decided that some things were worth standing for. I hoped we were making the right decision. Not with certainty. Not with the clean confidence that heroes have in stories. I hoped it the way that people hope when the stakes are real, and the outcome is genuinely unknown, and the only thing you can be sure of is that you made the choice you made for honest reasons. That was enough. It had to be. I sat down at my desk and kept reading. The message came at 0347 station time, while I was still at my desk. It was from Captain Alton Webb, relayed through Okafor's command network, and it was not encrypted or coded. It was plain text, which meant he had sent it knowing it would be read by anyone monitoring the channel, including the Assembly Fleet. Assembly Fleet has begun movement toward Meridian 7 station. Speed is slow and deliberate, not an attack formation, a demonstration approach. Estimate contact in 4 hours. We are holding. All crews present and steady. Web out. I read it 3 times. Then I picked up my communicator and called Okafor. She was already on. I see it. Demonstration approach, I said. They're going to burn the station. That's my assessment, she said. Low speed, high visibility. They want every sensor array in range to record it. They want footage of an assembly fleet acting against a human installation while we do nothing. Except the station is empty, I said. Except the station is empty, she agreed. Which means the footage will show an assembly fleet burning an empty human station while 3 human ships watch. That is a different kind of footage. Does the Defense Council know? The vote on defensive engagement authorization is still in session, Okafor said. It's been 14 minutes. 14 minutes. 4 hours before contact. The math was not comfortable. I stood up. I walked to the terminal and opened the connection to the Assembly diplomatic channel, the formal one, the one that went directly to Vreth Solon's office. I waited. The response came in 6 minutes. Not the executor, a senior aide, whose name I did not have, whose species I did not immediately recognize. Ambassador Vasquez, the aide said. The executor is not available for direct communication at this time. Then I am leaving a message, I said, to be delivered immediately, and verbatim. Tell the executor that if the enforcement fleet fires on the Meridian 7 station, I will request an emergency session of the full assembly chamber and formally present evidence that the mandate program constitutes a systemic policy of managed decline against supervised species, using the Assembly's own internal records as the basis for that evidence. Tell the executor that I am not making this threat. I am informing them of the procedural step I will take, as is my right as a member delegate, under Assembly Charter Article 19. I paused. Tell the executor, I said this personally. The aide went still for a moment. I will relay the message. The channel closed. I sat back down. I looked at the ceiling of my quarters and thought about the 4,200 people who had left their homes on Meridian 7 and climbed onto transports because someone they trusted told them to. I thought about Captain Webb and his crew, sitting in a carrier at grid 779, watching 11 ships approach at a slow and deliberate speed. My communicator rang. It was Paul. The Defense Council voted, he said. Authorization for defensive engagement parameters is granted. If the assembly fleet fires on the Meridian 7 station while our ships are in range, our crews are authorized to respond. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Paul said. If they fire, and our people respond, we're in a different situation, one that doesn't end in a chamber debate. I know, I said. How are you holding up? I'm fine, I said. And I meant it, in the way that people mean it, when what they really mean is that they have put aside every feeling that isn't useful and locked it away until there is time and safety to feel it properly. Kira, Paul said, and his voice was quieter. Whatever happens in the next few hours, you've already done something that nobody before you has done. You stood in that room and said no, and you said it in front of everyone. It won't matter if the fleet burns the station and the council flinches, I said. It will matter to history, he said. That's not nothing. No, it wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough either. History is cold comfort when the people making it are still in the middle of it. The next 3 hours were the longest of my life. I monitored the sensor feed relay from Okafor's command network on the terminal in my quarters. The assembly fleet moved toward Meridian 7 at that slow and terrible pace, exactly as Webb had described. Not aggressive, patient, certain. Our 3 ships did not move. At 1 hour before contact, I sent a single message to Webb. How are your people? His response came 12 minutes later. Scared and steady. Same thing. We're good. Scared and steady. That was the most honest thing anyone said to me in the entire crisis, and I carried it with me for the rest of my life. At 40 minutes before contact, the assembly fleet stopped. Just stopped. In open space, a full hour of travel away from the Meridian 7 station. Drive signatures went to minimal power. Formation held. No communications. Okafor's voice came through the terminal. They've stopped. I have no explanation yet. I sat forward in my chair. 11 minutes later, a communication came through the Assembly diplomatic channel. Not from Vreth Solon. From the Assembly's Internal Review Committee, a body I had found referenced in the charter, but had never expected to hear from directly. It was brief. An emergency review of the Developmental Mandate Program has been called by petition of 11 Assembly member species. All enforcement activities related to the Earth Mandate are suspended pending review. Duration of suspension, indefinite. This is a binding procedural order under Charter Article 32. Executor Vreth Solon's office has been notified. I read it twice. Then I sat very still for a long time. 11 species. I thought about the Preth delegate, the Marathi voices I had heard in the chamber. The others who had spoken, more than I had expected. They had gone back to their communications systems after the session, and they had filed a petition, which under Assembly law, required only 9 signatures, and triggered a mandatory internal review that even an executor could not override. They had read Athene's data. They had looked at the population curves. They had done the math on their own situations, their own histories, their own futures, and they had decided that watching Earth go through what they had gone through was not something they were willing to simply observe. I opened the channel to Okafor. "Did you get the review committee order?" I asked. "Received it 40 seconds ago," she said. "The fleet is maintaining its stopped position. No movement in either direction. Webb and his crews? Holding, awaiting orders. Tell them to hold for now," I said. "And tell them." I stopped. I thought about what to tell them. Tell them to get some rest if they can. They've been sitting there long enough. A small pause. "I'll tell them." I opened Paul's channel next. He was already smiling slightly when his face appeared on screen. "I heard." "I heard too," I said. "This isn't over," he said, immediately, because he was Paul, and he was right. A suspension isn't a reversal. The review could take months. The Assembly could still come back with the same mandate after the review concludes. "I know," I said. "And Vreth Solon is not going to be happy. I know that too. But right now," he said, and the slight smile came back. "Right now, 11 alien species petitioned an assembly they are afraid of, on behalf of a species they just met, because you stood in a room and told the truth in front of everyone." I did not say anything for a moment. "They petitioned because they looked at the data," I said. "They petitioned because the data was real." "The data has been real for 200 years, Paul said. "Someone had to stand in the room and say it." I sat back in my chair. Outside the viewport, the docking spines of the ring hung in the dark, and the stars beyond them were exactly as old as they had always been. Nothing out there had changed. The assembly was still 8,000 years old. The enforcement fleet was still out there, stopped but present. The review could still go against us. And 4,200 people were on transports heading home, because the homes they had been asked to leave for a few weeks were still standing, and the station above them was still intact, and nobody had fired a weapon. That was the day's work, not a victory in any clean or final sense. A day's work. I thought about Counselor Athene. I needed to find them before the review period began. I needed to talk to them about what a review actually meant for the Varathan, and the Preth, and the other 39 supervised species whose names I had memorized from the data chip, one by one, over 3 nights of reading. I thought about Captain Webb saying scared and steady. I thought about standing in the center of that enormous chamber, in front of hundreds of species that had made their choices long before I arrived, and saying the thing that needed to be said. "We did not survive 10,000 years of ourselves to kneel before you." I had not said it because I was certain we would win. I had said it because it was true, because it needed to be on record, in that chamber, in front of every translation system, and every observer, and every species that had once stood in a circle like the one I stood in, and given a different answer. We were not braver than them. We were not better. We were just the ones standing there that day, and we had said what we actually meant. The review would take time. The fight was not over. It might not be over for years. I picked up my communicator and sent a message to Ethine. Counselor, when you have a safe moment, I'd like to talk. Not about Earth, about yours. Then I closed my eyes, leaned back in the chair that was slightly wrong for a human body, and for the first time in 4 days, let myself breathe. Outside the viewport, the stars did not care. They had been watching civilizations make choices like this one for longer than any of the species in that chamber had been alive. But somewhere in the dark between them, 3 human ships were still holding their coordinate, and their crews were eating whatever the ship dispensaries had managed to produce, and they were talking in the low voices that people use when the crisis has passed its peak but has not fully ended, and they were carrying the weight of what they had been asked to carry, and they had not put it down. They were still there. We were still there. And that, for the moment, was exactly enough.